Joy Reid thought she could destroy Pam Bondi's Attorney General nomination with accusations of racism and corruption on live television. What happened next ended Reid's 8-year MSNBC career and exposed the biggest media bias scandal in cable news history. The MSNBC studios in Rockefeller Center buzzed with anticipation on that cold December evening as producers prepared for what they'd internally called a must-see television moment. Joy Reid sat behind her familiar desk on the readout, reviewing her notes for what she'd privately described as the interview that would end Pam Bondi's political career before it starts. Pam Bondi appeared via satellite from her law office in Tampa, wearing a sharp charcoal suit and carrying herself with the composed confidence of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms and political battles. As Florida's former Attorney General and Trump's nominee for U.S. Attorney General, she'd agreed to the interview, despite warnings from her team that Reid would likely attempt a character assassination disguised as journalism. Reid had spent weeks preparing what she called her comprehensive takedown of Bondi's nomination, compiling what she believed was damning evidence of corruption, racism, and incompetence that would make Bondi's confirmation impossible. She'd coordinated with Democratic operatives, progressive activists, and anti-Trump organizations to ensure maximum impact from the interview. As the cameras rolled and the familiar MSNBC graphics filled the screen, Reid launched into what she thought would be a systematic destruction of Trump's most controversial cabinet pick. Good evening, I'm Joy Reid, and tonight we're joined by Pam Bondi, Donald Trump's nominee for Attorney General, a woman whose record of corruption, racial bias, and political weaponization of the justice system makes her uniquely unqualified to lead the Department of Justice. Reid looked directly into the camera with the righteous indignation that had made her a progressive media star. Mrs. Sikimubber Bondi, let's start with the obvious question. How can you claim to represent equal justice under law when your entire career has been built on protecting white supremacists, suppressing black votes, and covering up for corrupt politicians? It was classic Reid. Skip any pretense of objectivity and launch straight into character assassination, using inflammatory language designed to make any response look defensive and weak. But Bondi had been expecting this exact approach. She'd spent her career as a prosecutor dealing with hostile cross-examinations, and she knew how to handle someone who confused volume with authority. Joy, I appreciate you having me on, though I have to say your introduction contains so many false statements that I'm not sure where to begin correcting them, Bondi replied, her voice calm and professional despite the aggressive attack. Let's start with your claim that I've protected white supremacists. That's not just wrong, it's defamatory. As Florida's Attorney General, I prosecuted hate crimes, shut down white supremacist organizations, and worked with civil rights groups to ensure equal protection under law. Reid tried to interrupt, but Bondi continued smoothly. You also claimed I've suppressed black votes, which is particularly ironic, given that I've consistently supported voter ID laws that protect the integrity of elections for all citizens, regardless of race. Suggesting that requiring identification to vote is racist implies that you think black Americans are somehow incapable of obtaining ID, which is itself a racist assumption. The studio fell silent, except for the hum of equipment. Reid's confident expression was already starting to falter. But what really bothers me about your introduction, Joy, is that you've prejudged my qualifications based on political bias rather than actual facts, Bondi continued. So before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you actually reviewed my record as Attorney General? Or are you just reading talking points someone else prepared? Reid's face flushed slightly. I've done my research, Ms. Bondi. Have you? Bondi interrupted gently. Because if you'd done your research, you'd know that during my tenure as Florida Attorney General, we had the highest prosecution rate for civil rights violations in the state's history. You'd know that we created the first statewide human trafficking task force. You'd know that we recovered over $2 billion in fraudulent settlements for Florida consumers. Maframo won. She leaned forward slightly toward the camera. But you didn't mention any of that in your introduction, did you, Joy? Because those facts don't fit the narrative you're trying to create. Reid tried to regain control with another attack. Ms. Bondi, let's talk about your relationship with Donald Trump. You received a $25,000 donation from the Trump Foundation just days before deciding not to investigate Trump University. That's textbook corruption. It was the gotcha moment Reid had been building toward the smoking gun she believed would destroy Bondi's credibility and end her nomination. But Bondi was ready for this too. Joy, I'm glad you brought that up because it gives me a chance to correct another piece of misinformation that's been circulating, Bondi replied. The timeline you just described is completely false. She pulled out a document and held it up to the camera. This is the actual timeline of events. The Trump Foundation donation was made in September 2013. The decision not to join the New York Attorney General's investigation of Trump University was made in October 2013, but it was based on the fact that we had no Florida victims who had filed complaints with our office. Reid looked confused, clearly not expecting such a detailed factual response. But here's what you didn't mention, Joy, Bondi continued. In 2014, when we did receive complaints from Florida residents about Trump University, we immediately opened an investigation. We ultimately recovered $750,000 in settlements for Florida victims. She set the document down. So your narrative of corruption falls apart when you look at the actual facts and timeline. But you didn't bother to check the facts, did you? You just repeated a false story because it fit your political agenda. Reid was starting to look desperate, her usual confidence completely gone. Ms. Urs, Bondi, what about your record on LGBTQ rights? You fought against marriage equality, opposed anti-discrimination protections. I enforced Florida law as it existed at the time, Bondi interrupted. As Attorney General, my job wasn't to make law, it was to enforce the law as written by the legislature and interpreted by the courts. When the Supreme Court ruled on marriage equality, we immediately complied with that decision. She looked directly at Reid. But I'm curious about something, Joy. You seem to think that an attorney general should ignore existing law and substitute their personal political views. Is that really the kind of justice system you want? One where prosecutors pick and choose which laws to enforce based on their political preferences? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Reid clearly had no good answer. That's not what I said, Reid began weakly. It's exactly what you said, Bondi replied. You're criticizing me for enforcing laws you disagreed with, which means you think attorneys general should ignore laws they don't like. That's not justice. That's political activism. Reid made one more desperate attempt to salvage the interview. Ms. Bondi, the bottom line is that you're a Trump loyalist who will weaponize the Department of Justice to go after his political enemies. Joy, let me ask you something. Bondi said, her voice taking on a prosecutorial edge. Have you ever actually read the Constitution? Have you studied how the Department of Justice is supposed to function? Reid looked genuinely confused by the question. Because if you had, Bondi continued, you'd know that the Attorney General serves the American people, not any individual president. You'd know that DOJ operates under strict guidelines that prevent political interference in prosecutorial decisions. She leaned forward. But more importantly, you'd know that for the past 4 years, we've watched the current DOJ actually weaponize the justice system against political opponents. We've seen unprecedented prosecutions of a former president, raids on political opponents, and investigations that seem designed more to influence elections than to pursue justice. Reid tried to interrupt, but Bondi wasn't finished. So when you talk about weaponizing the DOJ, you're describing exactly what's been happening under the current administration. My job, if confirmed, will be to restore the department's credibility and ensure that justice is applied equally regardless of political affiliation. She sat back in her chair. But I don't expect you to report that accurately, Joy, because this interview has made it clear that you're more interested in political advocacy than actual journalism. So, the silence that followed was deafening. Reid sat frozen behind her desk, clearly having no idea how to respond to someone who just systematically dismantled every attack she'd prepared. I think we should wrap up here, Reid finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Actually, Joy, I'd like to say one more thing, Bondi said, looking directly into the camera. To the people watching at home, what you've witnessed tonight is exactly what's wrong with mainstream media. You've seen a host who came into this interview with predetermined conclusions, false information, and a clear political agenda. She paused. Joy Reid didn't invite me on this show to have a substantive discussion about the Department of Justice or my qualifications to lead it. She invited me on to attack me with lies and distortions, hoping I wouldn't be prepared to defend myself. Her voice grew stronger. But here's what she didn't count on. I've spent my entire career dealing with people who try to substitute emotion for evidence, who think volume equals authority, who believe that if they repeat a lie often enough, it becomes true. She looked directly at Reid. That approach might work with some guests, Joy, but it doesn't work with prosecutors. We deal in facts, evidence, and truth. and tonight the truth has exposed your bias for everyone to see. The interview ended with Reid looking completely defeated, her usual righteous indignation replaced by obvious embarrassment. Within hours, clips of the interview were viral across every platform. But unlike Reid's usual viral moments where she appeared to destroy conservative guests, these clips showed her being methodically dismantled by someone who'd come prepared with facts. The response was immediate and brutal. Even liberal commentators struggled to defend Reid's performance. Media critics called it one of the most biased and unprofessional interviews in cable news history. MSNBC's own journalists began questioning whether the network's credibility had been permanently damaged. But the real impact came from the network's advertisers and viewers. Within 48 hours, 3 major companies had pulled their advertising from the Reid out, citing concerns about the show's lack of journalistic standards. Reid's ratings, already declining, plummeted to historic lows as even progressive viewers expressed embarrassment about her performance. The breaking point came when MSNBC's parent company, NBC Universal, received a formal complaint from the Florida Bar Association about Reid's defamatory statements regarding Bondi's record. The complaint, which included detailed documentation of Reid's false claims, triggered an internal investigation at the network. 2 weeks after the disastrous interview, MSNBC announced that Reid would be pursuing other opportunities and would no longer host her primetime show. The official statement thanked her for her passionate advocacy, but notably avoided defending her journalistic practices. Reid's firing sent shockwaves through progressive media circles. She'd been one of MSNBC's most prominent voices, someone who'd built her career on calling out what she saw as racism and injustice. Her downfall suggested that even the most ideologically aligned networks had limits when it came to defending obvious bias and factual errors. Bondi, meanwhile, saw her confirmation prospects improve dramatically. The interview had showcased her legal expertise, her ability to handle hostile questioning, and her command of facts under pressure. Even some Democratic senators privately admitted that Reid's attack had backfired and made Bondi look more qualified, not less. In her first interview after Reid's firing, Bondi was asked what she'd hoped to accomplish in that confrontation. "I wanted to demonstrate that facts matter more than narratives," she said. Joy Reid came into that interview with a predetermined story about who I am and what I represent. But when you actually look at my record, when you examine the facts rather than the fiction, a very different picture emerges. She continued, "I think what happened in that interview shows why Americans have lost trust in mainstream media. When journalists abandon objectivity in favor of activism, when they substitute emotion for evidence, they're not serving the public. They're serving their own political agenda." The interviewer asked if she felt vindicated by Reid's firing. "I didn't set out to end anyone's career," Bondi replied, "but I do think there have to be consequences when journalists abandon basic professional standards." Joy Reid's firing wasn't about politics, it was about accountability. Weschement, the lesson was clear. In an age of social media, an instant fact-checking media bias can backfire spectacularly when it encounters someone who's prepared to fight back with facts. And when ideological activism masquerades as journalism, the truth has a way of exposing the difference. Joy Reid thought she could destroy Pam Bondi's Attorney General nomination with accusations of racism and corruption, using her MSNBC platform to launch a character assassination disguised as journalism. Instead, she exposed herself as a biased activist who'd confused her political agenda with actual reporting. Her career-ending encounter with Bondi became a perfect example of what happens when media bias meets legal expertise, when predetermined narratives confront actual facts, and when someone who's built their career on emotion tries to take down someone who's built theirs on evidence.